A beautiful and fairly well-known story of the Rebbe Rashab shows us how we can completely revolutionize the way in which we educate and incentivize our children about Torah and about a connection to Hashem. In regards to the 20th of Cheshvan, which is the birth date of the Rebbe Rashab, from Bali Yom Heledes, the Friedrich Rebbe told the story. Story about his father, the Rebbe Rashab, which occurred when the Rebbe Rashab was 4 or 5 years old in the week of Parshas Vayeira. It's recorded in the Hayom Yom as well. What's the story? The Rebbe Rashab went to his grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek, in order to get the annual bracha for his birthday. And he started to cry. Why did he cry? He explained, how come the Eibishter appeared to Avraham Avinu, not to the Rebbe Rashab or to us generally? The Tzemach Tzedek answered him, as Ayid Tzaddik to 99 year, when you have a Jew who is already a Tzaddik and has achieved the status of 99 years old, his Machde as a Dav sich mol sein, and realizes that he still has to take the major step of having a bris, is a veret as David deserves Hashem's revelation. This is a story the Rebbe has discussed multiple times and taught various lessons from. As we learn lessons from all of the stories of our Rabbein that were shared with us. Especially if it was the Rabbein themselves who shared and broadcast those stories. And therefore they obviously have lessons for us. But here, we're going to focus on another area, another facet of the story from which we can learn a lesson. The Friedrich Rebbe was very specific when he told the story, as the Bali Yom Heledes is done from fear or the. He made a point of telling us that the Rebbe Rashab was very young at the time, 4 or 5 years old. So if you consider the words of a Rebbe, and especially if the Rebbe says something in public and expects it to be printed, his must be absolutely precise. So we have to conclude that this detail of the story of how young the Rebbe Rashab was when the story happened is not only to tell us how amazing the Rebbe Rashab was and how great he was, as if the fact that at such a young age what bothered him was the fact that the Eibishter hadn't revealed himself. Compare that to an average 4 or 5 year old. And it was something that bothered him so badly to the extent that he cried. That's a beautiful element of the story, but the age of the Rebbe Rashab in the story teaches each one of us a lesson in terms of our own children and how we educate them. Und therefore is verstandig, even though there are many, many lessons to learn from the story, as the Rebbe has discussed in previous sichos, but there's a very important lesson, a foundational lesson, which is relevant to children at a similar age, 4 or 5 years old, which is effectively before the age of formal education. We're not only talking here about a person who is a mature adult with a spiritual maturity of a 4 or 5 year old, who hasn't yet been fully educated. In other words, we're not only talking about the person, or this is also addressed to the person who doesn't have a full understanding about Torah and about the Eibishter, and that would be perhaps describing a person not only who lacks their own independent insight and understanding, but also has the inability to really learn in a meaningful way from others. Obviously, part of the lesson is that even such a person who is so spiritually hollow, who doesn't have that depth, they also can demand and really in a meaningful personal way, similar to something that upsets us to the point of crying. Whenever a person cries so bitterly, it indicates that this is something that has affected us in a way that is beyond our own scope and our own persona. As the Eibishter that a simple Jew can also cry about the fact that they want the Eibishter to be revealed to them, even at the extent that Avraham Avinu experienced Hashem, which is obviously a very advanced experience of revelation. V'hatam, v'baldas Avraham Avinu is from the Gimel of Shekalecha v'echam mibnei Yisrael shebechol hadoros, and the reason that a person would have this expectation is because Avraham Avinu is one of our forefathers. Is by jeden einem von die Banim Dabirush die Nyolim was einen given by the others, and so therefore it is instilled within us, it's inherent within us that we know that we all have access to some or another degree to the things that the Avos had. So if Avraham Avinu experienced Gilui Elokus, so should we. So it's true that part of the lesson is for the person who is spiritually behind, that they could also have this pining for Hashem to reveal Himself to them. But the main thing we're going to focus on is the lesson for the person who's actually physically at that young age of 4 or 5 years old. Now, the lesson being that we can educate a young child in such a way as a zalmonim betoikef, that the child will independently demand with all of his might, ad kedei bechir, to the point that he cries over it. As the Eibishter soll sich zum Bavisen wie zu Avraham Avinu, that the Eibishter should appear to him as the Eibishter appeared to Avraham Avinu. Now, how are we going to get there? We might ask, how are we going to make a comparison between the Rebbe Rashab, who clearly was a highly advanced neshama, to an ordinary child? The Rebbe Rashab was somebody who was holy from the first day he breathed, and he was in a lineage of Rebbeim. So even at the youngest age, he could already start to get a sense of what kind of an individual he would grow up to be and how great he would be. Like the expression goes, that even the small cucumbers, you can see how they're going to grow up, which the Gemara uses as an expression that from a young age you can tell where a person will develop to become. The Rebbe Rashab, as a 4-year-old, was far more advanced, even intellectually, than a 4-year-old and even than an adult. So how could we be learning from the Rebbe Rashab, who is on a pedestal spiritually, for every ordinary child? The Alter Rebbe tells us in Hilchas Talmud Torah that education is bespoke, depends on the person, depends on their abilities, depends on how sharp they are. So how could we make how could we expect a kind of chinuch for our children like the Rebbe Rashab had? And of course, we have already mentioned that if the Frierdiker Rebbe advertised the story, it must have a lesson not only for Rebbeim but also for us. The fact that the story was publicized and printed is araya. That indicates that this is not something which is Rebbe she'inyonim, for somebody who is head and shoulders above the populace. Now, the fact that it's publicized and made accessible to all of us means that it's part of the Rebbe's life that is relevant to us and attainable for us. But surely we would have been satisfied to say this is a lesson for us as mature adults, that we should learn to prioritize and to really care about Gilui Elokus in our world, and it should actually bother us. Even if that includes people who are physically adult but spiritually immature. But what is so compelling to say that the message of this story has to be specifically directed also at little children? So to understand that, let's understand the concept of chinuch. One of the things about chinuch is that we find there are various stages of chinuch. Even though we mentioned that the broad spectrum of chinuch is different for every single child, and you have to know who the child is and aim towards where they are. But there are certain milestones of chinuch that are age-related. To the extent that we have a broad principle that you don't take a child into formal education under the age of 6, but once they're 6, then you stuff them full with knowledge like you force feed an ox. As the mitakotten is an ephraim from safeli keturah, which implies that when a child is young, you kind of you teach them in a way that you're kind of bombarding them almost in a sense with information. And that obviously is going to open the gateway to take this child to a very advanced type of chinuch. But when does that all start? Only from 6 years old. And in our story, we're talking about a child who is 4 or 5 years old. Even though the concept of a 6-year-old is also somewhat flexible, because we say, as das ist toloi in Kerabenu binyan gufa, like the Rambam says, Depends on the physical stature and stamina of the child. And if a child is a little bit physically weak, we wait until they're 7 years old to formally start their education. But what is universal is that we don't bring a child into formal education before the age of 6. Even if he is robust. Even if he's way ahead of his age group. Das heißt, als der Schir von Bashis, wenn geht zum Minium von Safrike Turschlemes Achinach, is nicht toll in das Verkehr HaKotten. So that illustrates to us that the real efforts of Chinuch, which start where you stuff the child with information, that starts from the age of 6, regardless of the personal standing of the child. Salderch von Shir ben Yigimel mitzvahs, which is similar to Bar Mitzvah. As I feel when es sein HaKotten abadas godel beyoser, even if you had a child under 13 who is brilliant, still is a potter for mitzvahs minatera v'etnitin starved to a minyan b'chulei. The child is not yet obligated to fulfill mitzvahs, doesn't count for a minyan because it is an age milestone. So chinuch is an age milestone that really only kicks off at the age of 6. Why is that? So to appreciate why chinuch is set up in the particular way that it is, let's revisit the difference between how Torah mitzvahs happened before the giving of the Torah versus how we experience Torah mitzvahs now after Matan Torah. So Chassidus explains that all of the efforts that a person would put into their Torah and mitzvahs before Matan Torah could only elevate both them and their mitzvahs to what is called Sheresh HaNivroim, the spiritual point from which all of creation begins. So if we're trying to reach, so to speak, the highest level within the created reality, then our personal abilities are going to play a role in that. Each person, depending on their abilities, depending on their makeup of their neshama, would determine how far they reach in terms of drawing energy from this Sheresh HaNivroim, from the root, so to speak, of their own creation. So the entire experience of mitzvahs before the Torah was given was trying to reach spiritual realms, and therefore the most important thing was your spiritual abilities, and far less so the physical items that you used in order to fulfill the mitzvah. That's why we know quite well from the Zohar that when Yaakov Avinu played with the sticks in order to genetically modify the sheep that he was going to get from his father-in-law Lavan, he actually achieved the same spiritual impact on the world as if he would have put on tefillin. Why? Because before the Torah was given, any growth in terms of spirituality was purely spiritual. The physical really didn't play a major role. Now that we, however, engage with Torah mitzvahs post the giving of the Torah, that allows us the opportunity not only to plug in to the source from where creation begins, but to ma'atzil, to the dimension of Eibishter, which is completely beyond not only creation, not only that which is beyond creation, but even higher than that. And none of us, no created being, not us, not angels, nobody in the created reality is capable of reaching to such a height. The only reason it happens is because that's what the Eibishter, the source of all energy and all life, decided is going to happen. And the system the Eibishter made was, you fulfill mitzvah X, that will impact the following spiritual result. And therefore the only way the mitzvah works is if it fits the protocol that the Eibishter decided. We can't grow a mitzvah, we can't choose a mitzvah, we can't define a way for ourselves to connect to Hashem because it's beyond our pay grade, it's over our heads, and only what the Eibishter offers us as an opportunity is an opportunity we can take. And it might even be possible that in today's world you'll have a tzaddik of the caliber of Yaakov Avinu who could create the same spiritual impact in the world that Yaakov did through his sticks. But all of that great spiritual wonder that he might create would never elevate higher than the source from which the created reality begins. And he would be unable, so you do major, beautiful spiritual things that would impress everybody, but you wouldn't gain access to the Eibishter's power which is the purpose for which the Torah was given. So, simply put, prior to the giving of the Torah, spiritual experiences were relative to the power of the individual because the scope of spiritual reach was relative to the power of the individual. After the giving of the Torah, the way that we achieve what Torah mitzvahs is all about is the gift from Hashem. We have to follow the steps exactly, otherwise we don't key into that gift. So if that's true of how we do a mitzvah, it's also true of when we do a mitzvah. You could have a child who is an absolute genius, way beyond an adult. Okay, that is on the scale of created beings and their limited capacity. This child has more capacity than another adult who also has limited capacity. But if that child now wants to draw into this world something that is beyond human capacity, what a mitzvah is supposed to achieve, well, there the rules and the protocols are that you only gain access to what the Eibishter has to offer the world through a mitzvah only once you hit the age of 13. It's not up to the individual. And the same principle applies to chinuch. Yes, of course, you could have brilliant little kids, but in order to have the experience of chinuch as the Eibishter wants it, there's a specific protocol, and that begins from the age of 6. That relates back to our story, which is a child under the age of 6. Because the Rebbe Rashab at that time was younger than 6, he was either 4 or 5 years old. So therefore it doesn't matter that the Rebbe Rashab was a brilliant prodigy child at that age. But despite his brilliance, he still had the limitation of being younger than the Torah's mandated age of chinuch, and therefore he hadn't yet, despite all of his greatness, experienced what true chinuch is, because that is a divine protocol, not a personal achievement. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe publicizes the story of the Rebbe Rashab and his experiences before the age of chinuch, which implies the fact that he advertised that the Frierdiker Rebbe told the story tells us this is not something which is limited only to Rebbeim. Hat der Rebbe Medaille gewinnt zu erzählen und echt den Prat, dass der Rebbe nicht mal sehen ist gewinnt ein Kind von 4 oder 5 Jahren, and the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe made sure, dafke in that story, to emphasize for us that the age of the Rebbe Rashab at the time the story is 4 or 5 years old is verstandig. As das ist scheich zu jedem Yiddish Kind, was ist Botzemi Bar Shis? It's because the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted us to have a lesson that is relevant to any child who's still young enough not to yet have formal education. Because as far as the Torah is concerned, under the age of 6, everybody's essentially in the same category, not yet at the level of mandated chinuch. Could be the Rebbe Rashab, could be an ordinary child. You're not yet at the stage of mandated chinuch. So therefore there's got to be a lesson for us, and we've got to work out what this lesson is. So now that we have established, and we've mentioned already a few times, that the Frierdiker Rebbe, by publicizing this story, wanted to teach every one of us a cardinal principle of chinuch that is across the board, wird man verstehen, wie in dem Sipper liegt, nicht da mai roin avidas Hashem bis auf die Faktanim nach Chiddush Ikre beneged dem Eifen HaChinuch. We'll now work out that not only does this story have a good lesson about education, it actually has a revolutionary insight into education that will completely change how we view education. So let's first look at the classical approach to how you incentivize children in education as taught by the Rambam, and then see what the story completely innovates about that. So the Rambam is marich beneged dem Eifen HaLimud mit HaKotten. The Rambam goes into detail how you educate a child, as men dafim is that you've got to incentivize the child using things that the child relative at his age would appreciate. For example, you read this pasuk and I'll give you nuts, which I guess was a treat in those days. And the Rambam writes clearly it's because the child is still young and immature and therefore doesn't really appreciate the value of Torah independently, so you've got to give him incentives. And then he'll grow up and one day appreciate Torah for what it is. This story, however, of the Rebbe Rashab has a different expectation of a child. Here's a story, which is supposed to be a lesson for all of us, that a child should be bothered to the extent that he cries, not because he's not getting his candies, but he's crying over the fact, why doesn't the Eibishter appear to me? Das heißt, dass man darf mechanech sein ein Kind, das Göttlichkeit so werden ein Teil von sein Leben. In other words, the lesson of the story is that we should educate kids in such a way that Elikus is so real to them, that it becomes that's what they actually like, more than a candy or a prize. Beizazim soll stark verarren, was der Eibishter beweist sich nicht zu ihm, und in dem Öfen, wer hat sich beweisen zu Avraham Avinu. So that what the child cares about is, why hasn't the Eibishter appeared to me, one, and number two, why hasn't the Eibishter appeared to me as he did to Avraham Avinu? Had there not been the story of the Rebbe Rashab, we wouldn't know that it was actually possible to instill this sensitivity in every Jewish child. Because the Rambam's already told us that the human nature of a child is to care about small, petty, physical things. So we'd go with the Rambam's approach, which is offer the child things that the child can appreciate and relate to, and that's how education works. But post this story with the Rebbe Rashab, and especially when you consider that the Friedrich Rebbe publicized the story and expected us to print it, in other words, that it's really for the public, is that that means that the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, now revealed to us and effectively opened a brand new channel of how chinuch works, as it's durch chinuch kideboy, that it is now possible with the appropriate kind of chinuch of children. We are now able to completely modify and totally shift the nature of kids. We can now activate a way to inspire children that they should care about and wish for spiritual things. To the extent that we can get our kids to the point that they yearn, they wish for the Eibishter to reveal himself to them. And if we encounter a Jewish child who is not bothered by the fact that the Eibishter hasn't revealed himself, it's not weil is nicht shaykh to them. It's not an indictment on the child that the child is too immature or the child is too materialistic. It's an indictment on the educator who hasn't obviously expressed this concept in a way that is heartfelt, that the child would take it on board. Because that's where chinuch should be now, is that children should care about Gilui Elikus. So now that we understand this incredible insight, that the lesson of the Rebbe Rashab is how we educate children, that they should care to the point of crying over the fact that the Eibishter hasn't revealed himself to them, well then obviously the Tzemach Tzedek's response has to be part of the lesson. So the Tzemach Tzedek's reply, which was, that tzaddik to 99 years macht as it darf sich mol sein, that a 99-year-old tzaddik takes the resolution that he has to have a bris, is a vert as by the Eibishter soll sich beweisen zu ihm, for that he deserves to have the Eibishter reveal himself. Is das an Entfer made a shaykh zum chinuch von jedem idischen Kind. That is a response to every Jewish child, and it is part of how we create the education system for every Jewish child. Der Pshat in Empfer von Tzemach Tzedek ist doch nicht, dass der Eibishter hat sich beweisen nur zu Avraham. What the Tzemach Tzedek is telling the Rebbe Rashab is not only the Eibishter only appeared to Avraham Avinu. Weil hat machen gewesen zu 99 Jahren, darf sich mal sein, because Avraham Avinu did something unique, at the age of 99 prepared to have a bris. Aber als andere befragt dem Rebbe nicht was, hat es kein Scheiches nicht. The Tzemach Tzedek wasn't trying to dismiss other people, including the Rebbe Rashab, and say, but you are not there and it can't happen to you. Because if that was his intention, then the Tzemach Tzedek could have just said very simply, we can't compare ourselves to Avraham Avinu. End of story. He's at a different level to us. That's not the Tzemach Tzedek's response and message. Now the pshat is, rather the Tzemach Tzedek is giving us an insight how not only can we care about the fact that the Eibishter hasn't revealed himself to us, but we can actually attain a state where the Eibishter will reveal himself to us. How so? By taking a strong resolution that no matter what spiritual situation we find ourselves in, even if we feel that we're at the top of our game at tzaddik, at 99, which is not just an age, it indicates a person who's almost at a state of perfection, We recognize that we have to have a bris milah, which means, das meint, man darf sich bewarnen und harven auf sein abnehmen, dem Zudek, dem Helen, behester ha'olam. The purpose of a milah is to remove a blockage, to remove concealment. So we realize it doesn't matter how much I have advanced in my own spirituality, I have this mega responsibility to remove the impediments to godliness in our world. And every single Jewish person is capable of having this sensitivity and awareness. Yes, Avraham Avinu was a unique human. He was a tzaddik. He was 99 years old. Every day of those 99 years was absolutely focused and filled with exactly what the Eibishter wanted. And therefore, when Avraham Avinu takes the decision to have a bris, which means to be aware of and wary of the concealment of the world, that's a viel größer Chiddush wie die Achlote von dem, was ist nicht tzaddik. It's a far more surprising attitude than us. We definitely have to be wary of the concealment of the world. Avraham Avinu, you wouldn't have expected it of him. Is that you're doing the minyan from Pesach, but as we know, the principle is that great tzaddikim, particularly earlier on in history, open channels for us. As noch dem wie einer hat gehodet auf a gewissen Inyan und mamshach even be'olam, when an outstanding tzaddik works really hard at a particular issue and brings the possibility of that issue into our world, is that damit posech dem Sinne for andere, that opens and makes it far more accessible for the rest of us. As dennoch kennen euch seit der Griechen der Minyan mit viel winzige Yegir, which means we could now achieve the same kind of concept of removing the impediments and the concealment of this world far more easily than if we were not riding on the incredible achievement of Avraham Avinu, and that's part of the message. Especially now that we're post-Matan Torah, was man kann oft durch a viel kleiner und geringerer Avoide. Das, was die Avis haben aufgetan durch Avoide Begier Gedola, we now live in a totally different environment where we can achieve through substantially less effort things that the Avis had to work incredibly hard to be able to achieve. Und das der Rauf in dem Tzemach Tzedek's Enverbin Achinuch Eiche zu Ketanim, that's the message of the Tzemach Tzedek's answer, not only for us as adults, but also in terms of the Chinuch of children. Nachdem wir mit Ruftaros beim Kind die Chukni Flow, as David soll sich beweisen sehen, after we achieve the first objective, which is to sensitize our children to the point that they should cry, why hasn't the Eibishter revealed to me? Davon im Mazber sein, then we address the issue. As the derech lot says, durch der Achlot as man darf sich allemal mol sein. We tell the child, it's not unattainable. You can reach a point of Gilui Likus. How? By taking the consistent commitment to always mol, to always remove impediments and impurities from your life and from the world. Sich bevornen und aropnem dem Helen vehester ha'olam, to be wary of and to remove the concealment that exists in our world. Das heißt, man darf sein Kind nicht spoiled werden von Helen vehester ha'olam. In other simple English, we have to educate children not to be afraid of the fact that the world seems to be such a dark and unspiritual and perhaps even anti-spiritual place. Auf ihm soll nicht Peil sein, was die Welt sagt, na was Torah will. We can educate and empower children not to be afraid of what the world says, but rather to be conscious of what the Torah wants. And we educate a child properly, as the pasuk tells us, then that becomes their constant state of being, even when they grow much older. Das ist bei ihm so eingewurzelt. Also gedenkt allemal, viele wenn schein in a hechre und a gar hechre madargen aber das Hashem, also muss ich mal sein. We have to inculcate so deeply into a child the sense of constantly battling the world and removing the concealment that even when the person has reached tremendous heights in terms of their spiritual growth, they won't be satisfied with that and they'll realize you've still got to mol, you've still got to remove impurity from the world. And das bringt Hashem bekatnusai, soll bei ihm sein Vayeira-Chof Hashem. And when the child has that clarity and has that principle inculcated within him, then even as a young child, the child could already experience Gilui Likus. Was das beleuchtet mit sein Sviven an Eifen von Rohoya Vayeira-Chof Olam, which means that the child lives in an illuminated space where there's consciousness and awareness of Hashem, and Hashem is real to the child. And then that obviously has an impact on the rest of the world. Everything that we have learned over here indicates that the Rabbeim opened a brand new approach that is revolutionary in terms of our relationship with Hashem, that we can have this relationship that we pine for divine revelation and then are proactive about it. The truth is, as each kann man sein idische Kinder zu glussen in Jonen von Nidigkeit nicht zu bescharcholei, nein an Öfen, as they, die in Jonen sollen werden atel von sehr leben, which means that we now are in a position that we can educate children in such a way that they don't have to be incentivized with extraneous elements because they realize the value of the holiness itself, Bis es verharrt sei, at der Begehr, was der Eibishter beweist sich nicht zu sein, wie hat sich bewiesen zu Avraham Avinu. As mentioned, we sensitize our children to the point that they literally cry over the fact, why hasn't the Eibishter revealed himself to me as he did to Avraham? That is a new channel of connection between us and Hashem. A very similar kind of unique approach is also what the Rabbi taught us about how we treat each other. And we'll illustrate this also with the story of the Rebbe Rashab when he was a young child. A beautiful story about how much it should bother us that another Jew might be in an uncomfortable position. So in the same way as it should bother us that we don't have Gidoi Lekus, it should bother us that another Yid is not okay. When the Rebbe Nishmas is given ben Dalet Shonim, the Rebbe Rashab was 4 at the time, so the local tailor once brought a particular outfit that he had made for the Rebbetzin. So they're busy looking at the outfit, and while this is happening, as a child, the Rebbe Rashab pulled out a piece of material that happened to be in the tailor's pocket. Der Schneider hat sich verschämt und hat sich angegeben verämpfen, also hat vergessen wegen der Stickel Schreider, was bei ihm geblieben war. The tailor felt terrible, he was highly embarrassed, and he started to explain. He totally forgot that he had this piece of material, which obviously had been from the material used for the outfit and was sitting in his pocket, and it looked like perhaps he had looked to steal it. Dennoch, als der Schneider ist weggegangen, so subsequently the tailor left, is der Schneider verschämt geworden. So the Rebbetzin said to the Rebbe Rashab, his mother said to him, look at that, because of your behavior, the tailor was embarrassed. Wenn das gehört, hat sich bitter voneinander gewöhnt. When the Rebbe Rashab heard that, he began to cry bitterly. In etliche Wochen herum ist reingegangen zu seinem Vater, der Rebbe Marash. Sometime later, the Rebbe Rashab went to his father, the Rebbe Marash, and hat bei ihm gefragt, wie ihm attacken seine Mama von Albonis upon him. And he asked, as a 4-year-old child, he asked the Rebbe Marash, how do I fix the fact that I caused embarrassment to another Jew? When sein Tatan gefragt, was fragte die Scheide? So obviously the Rebbe Marash asked him, why are you asking this question? He kept it generic and he said, I just need to know. Nicht erzählen dabei, was hat passiert, and he did not share any of the details what happened with the tailor. Als immer Rabbonis hat ihn gefragt, was hat nicht gewollt erzählen dem Taten die ganze Meise. So hearing this, his mother, the Rebbetzin, said, why didn't you want to tell your father the full story about the tailor? Hat geantwortet, he said something incredible. He says, genug was ist nicht schon geworden Albonis upon him. He says, it's bad enough that I already embarrassed the tailor. Should I now also transgress gossip and Lashon Hara? Now, if you analyze the story, it wasn't so terrible what the Rebbe Rashab did to the tailor. It wasn't the Rebbe Rashab's intention to embarrass the tailor. He was fiddling around, and so totally, unaware, he pulled out this piece of material. Und dazu noch ist das nicht given by Rabbi, it wasn't even in public. Bloß immer Rabbonis ist dabei given, it was the Rebbe Rashab, the tailor, and his mother. Von deswegen, wie Nora hat der Held, also Schneider hat sich verstimmt. Yet, as soon as the Rebbe Rashab realized that the tailor was embarrassed, hat das ihm stark genommen, bis zu Abchia Mora. It affected him so badly that he cried bitterly. Was das war, weiß doch. In other words, that shows us something about the Rebbe Rashab. As ihm hat verdrossen, nicht so viel, was der Albonis Problem ist gewesen durch ihm. He wasn't so upset about the fact that I am the cause of somebody's embarrassment. As ihm kommt ein Eidisch verkohlen, and therefore I deserve something to happen to me. Not die Etzem Sach, was ist verschämt geworden. What bothered him is the fact that a person, a fellow Jew, was in a state of shame. Und Pharao hat nicht gewollt erzählen seinen Taten wegen dem. And that's why he didn't want to tell the details when he shared his question with his father. Das nicht sein Scheide, von even though his father had asked him something, and perhaps it was his requirement in terms of honoring his father to answer his father's question, why he's asking. Ich wollte doch der Zelt gewähren, besides which, he wasn't telling the story. If he had told the story to the Rebbe Marash, wouldn't be to indict the tailor, would be to help him clarify what he's got to do to fix himself. The reason the Rebbe Rashab didn't want to share the details with his father is because he couldn't handle the thought of speaking badly about another Jew. Aber bald das macht uns erzählt dem dosigen Sipur, the fact that this story was also shared with us, zusammen mit der Adgosh, as der Rebbe Nishmas ist dann alt gewesen 4 Jahre, with the detail that the Rebbe Rashab was only 4, Es der von Araya, as ist kemen mechanich sein jede Yiddish Kind afil in dem Gil in Odem Oifen, that has exactly the same lesson as the lesson of the Rebbe Rashab crying about not seeing the Eibishter, the same lesson that we can educate our children to be so sensitive to the next person that even at a young age they could care about the next person's feelings much more than what's the consequence for me for having misbehaved. And so therefore this leaves us with a tremendous responsibility, a lesson in our responsibility to ensure the proper education, eigene Kinder, firstly our own children. Like the well-known teaching of the Rebbe Rashab, that just like putting on tefillin every single day is mandated by the Torah for every single Jew, regardless of how advanced or simplistic a person's understanding of Yiddishkeit is, a person has an equal obligation every single day to spend half an hour thinking about the education of their children. And then the person has to do everything within their power and even perhaps beyond their power to ensure that our children go in the correct way. But besides the responsibility we have to our own children, we have a responsibility to all Jewish children. Especially those children who for whatever reason were not given a proper Jewish education by their parents. Then, as the Rambam tells us, the responsibility lies on every educated member of the Jewish community. So to worry about the fact that every Jewish child has a proper chinuch. By educating children properly and sensitizing them to the next Jew and to the need to have Hashem's Giloi, that creates the Tzivos Hashem, the ultimate army, which will lead us out of Golus, together with our elders and with our young, together with Mashiach, should happen immediately.